America spent over $168 billion, dropped more bombs on Vietnam than every country combined dropped in all of World War II, and lost over 58,000 troops. And it still lost the war. Yeah, seriously. The most powerful military on Earth went up against an army fighting largely with rifles, bicycles, and tunnels and walked away in defeat. A monk set himself on fire in the middle of a busy street and didn't move, didn't scream, didn't flinch, while photographers captured every second of it. A village was destroyed so completely that an American officer said they had to destroy the town in order to save it. And the war didn't even start as America's war. It started as someone else's war that nobody in Washington actually wanted to inherit. So how did a French colonial conflict turn into the defining American catastrophe of the 20th century? To understand Vietnam, you have to go back before America was ever involved at all. Vietnam had been a French colony since the 1800s, part of French Indochina, and the French had no intention of giving it up. But a communist revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh had spent decades organizing resistance, and after Japan occupied Vietnam during World War II, his forces, the Viet Minh, filled the power vacuum the moment Japan surrendered. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence in 1945, actually opening his declaration by quoting the American Declaration of Independence almost word for word. He wanted America's support, he didn't get it. France wanted its colony back, we want Vietnam back, it's not yours anymore. We had it first, that's not how colonies work, it's exactly how colonies work. France went to war with the Viet Minh in 1946, and for 8 years neither side could finish the other off, until one battle changed everything. In 1954, French forces dug into a remote valley called Dun Bon Pha, convinced the Viet Minh could never move heavy artillery through the surrounding jungle mountains. The Viet Minh disassembled their artillery by hand and hauled it piece by piece up the mountainsides. The French garrison was surrounded, pounded for weeks, and finally overrun. France's colonial war was over. At the Geneva conference that followed, Vietnam was split in half at the 17th parallel, Communist North under Ho Chi Minh, anti-Communist South under a Catholic nationalist named Ngo Dinh Diem, with nationwide elections promised within 2 years to reunify the country. Those elections never happened. Diem, backed by the United States, refused to hold them almost certainly because everyone involved knew Ho Chi Minh would win. So no elections, he'll win. Exactly. Then we're not having them, and that single decision is where America's war actually begins. Washington's involvement started small: advisors, funding, weapons, the same domino theory logic that had already justified American money flowing into Greece and Korea. If South Vietnam fell to communism, the thinking went, its neighbors would fall next, one after another like dominoes. President Eisenhower sent military advisors. Kennedy expanded that number into the thousands. Diem's government, meanwhile, was becoming a serious liability of its own, corrupt, repressive, and deeply unpopular, particularly after his forces cracked down brutally on Buddhist monks protesting religious discrimination. That crackdown produced one of the most haunting images of the entire century: a monk named Thuc Quang Duc sitting calmly in the middle of a Saigon intersection and burning himself alive in protest, without so much as crying out. In November 1963, with quiet American acquiescence, Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a military coup. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. The war he had cautiously expanded now belonged entirely to his successor. Lyndon Johnson inherited a mess in South Vietnam, a revolving door of unstable governments, a communist insurgency growing stronger in the countryside, and a decision he badly wanted to avoid making. Then in August 1964, American destroyers reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The first attack happened. The second attack, the one that actually triggered everything, was murky at best and quite possibly never happened at all. It didn't matter. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution almost unanimously, giving Johnson sweeping authority to escalate the war without ever formally declaring one. Did they actually attack us a second time? The reports are unclear. Unclear how. Sonar operators may have misread their own equipment in bad weather, so we're not sure it happened. We're sure enough, send the resolution to Congress. By 1965, American combat troops were landing on Vietnamese beaches. By 1968, more than 500,000 of them were fighting in the jungle. This was not a war with a front line. Communist Viet Cong fighters blended into the villages of South Vietnam by day and struck at night, supplied and reinforced by the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sprawling supply network of jungle paths running through neighboring Laos and Cambodia that American bombers pounded relentlessly and never managed to close. American firepower was overwhelming: helicopters, napalm, a chemical defoliant called Agent Orange sprayed across millions of acres of jungle to strip away the cover the Viet Cong relied on. But firepower alone couldn't win a war where the enemy was nearly impossible to distinguish from the civilian population, and every village pacified by day could turn hostile again by night. American commanders measured progress in body counts. Body counts went up every month. Somehow, so did the size of the enemy they were fighting. Then came Tut. In January 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched a massive, coordinated surprise offensive across more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam simultaneously, including a direct assault on the American embassy grounds in Saigon itself. Militarily, Tut was a disaster for the Communists. Their forces were badly mauled. The Viet Cong in particular never fully recovered as a fighting force. But televisions across America had just shown millions of ordinary households images of enemy fighters breaching the walls of the U.S. Embassy in the supposedly secure capital of an ally the government kept insisting was winning. We're winning this war. Then why is the embassy under attack right now live on television? It's a temporary setback. It's the 11th hour of a holiday ceasefire and there are dead soldiers on the embassy lawn. The gap between what officials were saying and what Americans were watching on the evening news had never been wider, and it never fully closed again. Public opinion turned hard. Draft protests grew louder and angrier on college campuses across the country. In March 1968, a company of American soldiers killed several hundred unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly in the village of My Lai. The massacre was covered up for over a year before it became public. And when it finally did, it became a symbol, fair or not, of exactly what this war had become. Lyndon Johnson, politically exhausted and increasingly unpopular, announced he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968, promising, vaguely, a plan to end the war. Nixon's actual plan was called Vietnamization, gradually handing combat responsibility back to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops, all while secretly and dramatically expanding the bombing campaign into neighboring Cambodia, a country the United States was not officially at war with. So we're leaving. Eventually. But first we're expanding the bombing into a country we're not fighting in. Cambodia isn't a target. Cambodia is where their supply lines run. It will be. When leaked documents called the Pentagon Papers revealed in 1971 that multiple administrations had privately doubted the war was winnable for years while publicly insisting otherwise, the credibility gap became something closer to a credibility canyon. Peace talks in Paris dragged on for years, stalling repeatedly over the fate of South Vietnam's government, until a ceasefire agreement was finally signed in January 1973. American combat troops came home. The war officially was over for the United States. It was not over for Vietnam. The ceasefire barely held. Fighting between North and South resumed within months, and without American ground troops or the bombing support that had propped up Saigon for a decade, South Vietnamese forces began collapsing rapidly under renewed North Vietnamese offensives. By April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks were closing in on Saigon itself, and the government South Vietnam had spent 20 years being propped up to protect was falling apart in a matter of weeks. On April 30, 1975, with the city surrounded, the last Americans and a desperate crowd of South Vietnamese allies were evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the U.S. Embassy, some clawing at the fences trying to get onto departing aircraft that simply could not carry everyone. Hours later, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Saigon fell. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The war that had started as a French colonial holdover, inherited reluctantly by a country that kept telling itself it could still win it, ended in a rooftop evacuation broadcast to the entire world. The human cost was staggering on every side. Over 58,000 American service members dead. Estimates of Vietnamese military and civilian deaths, North and South combined, run well into the millions when the fighting in Laos and Cambodia is counted alongside it. The war left America questioning its own government's honesty, in a way it never fully recovered from, and left Vietnam devastated, reunified under communist rule, and left to rebuild for decades from the wreckage of a war that both France and America had told themselves, at different points, they could not afford to lose. Nearly 50 years later, historians still argue about exactly when Vietnam became unwinnable, whether it was Dien Bien Phu, the Gulf of Tonkin, or Tet. What almost nobody argues about anymore is the lesson underneath all of it. America inherited someone else's war convinced that this time, with enough firepower, the outcome would be different. It wasn't. It just took 20 years, 3 presidents, and 58,000 names on a black granite wall to prove it.